National Guard falls out in all this. So as Yvonne was mentioning, the military's gone through many changes because of the insecurity in Mexico, and one of the key events that take place is in 2009 when President Calderon declared in this case, his war on drugs, or really targeting what was called transnational criminal organizations. And the military got drawn into that very clearly early on, particularly in Ciudad Juarez. I was in Ciudad Juarez in May of 2009 doing research on a research trip with my other colleagues when they basically declared martial law in the city. The military came in, they took over all of the public services, they were basically running the government, they took over the policing functions. They were putting military soldiers in police vehicles to keep an eye on the police. But they were, again, the biggest problem, they were thrust into this more visible role of public safety. The military in Mexico has enjoyed a sense of anonymity, a sense of protection from a lot of public scrutiny. In many cases, it's considered to be less corrupt. It's just because it's not as transparent, in my view. But this really thrust them into that situation. And as a result of that, we saw some increase in human rights violations being documented. And there was a lot of pushback, particularly from governors and mayors, at this militarization of the military coming in, particularly in Chihuahua. I had a chance to have lunch with the Attorney General and the head of public safety for the state of Chihuahua. And they were very concerned about what Calderon was doing, and I know it was politically oriented too, because you had different political parties. But the point was that they resented the fact the military was taking over more of the public safety role, particularly at the state and local levels. Now, as I mentioned, public safety reform in Mexico has taken place at different times, even before President Calderon. Vicente Fox, who was, again, the PAN president who came in 2000, which ended the 70 years of pre-control, he tried to do something similar. He created the Federal Investigative Agency. It was meant to be similar to kind of like the US FBI and creating kind of a national level investigative police force. Also created a civilian Secretary of Public Safety. And that was to kind of help to kind of maybe depoliticize some of the security policy in the country. And he also created in this case, the Federal Preventive Police. But the issue was always this kind of still a lack of accountability, that there really wasn't kind of a clearly defined role and mission, identification. There was still that issue of transparency and also impunity, and whether in fact there would be a means available to hold public safety officials accountable. And so a lot of those changes didn't last. Again, we transitioned to Calderon, and then of course in 2012, the PRI comes back into power under Peña Nieto. And he also tried to do some reforms with public safety by creating what's called the Gendarmerie Nationale. I use the term SPF, a stability police force. That's a term that's used like the Italian Carabinieri and also the Civil Guard in Spain. They're meant to be kind of this idea of, again, a hybrid type of police and military. And so he tried to do something similar by creating the Gendarmerie. There was a goal to kind of follow a little bit of the Colombian National Police model at the time, which, if you know anything about Colombia, that's probably not a good model to follow, because they were, one of the main human rights violators in Colombia for many, many years, and came under the military. They weren't separate from, they actually under the military, subordinate to the military. So the bottom line is, under Peña Nieto, still ill-defined. There was a lot of opposition from other agencies in Mexico, particularly the non-governmental organizations, were concerned about human rights violations and some of the other things that were happening with some of these. As a counter to that, which was interesting, is the military actually expanded their military policing functions. So in this case, you had the Marines expanding their marine naval security, and then also the Army expanding their what we call the Policía Militar, military police agents, as kind of a counter or balance to what he was trying to do. So there really wasn't buy-in. There really wasn't kind of a sense of identity with this new model that Peña Nieto was trying to come up with. So when AMLO comes into office, of course, in 2018, first thing we see is the Plan Nacional de Paz y Seguridad. And this is what I focused my initial research when I came here to speak at Rice in 2019, was what was developing as a result of that. One of the key components, of course, was the formation of the National Guard. So I wanted to kind of look at where, in fact, this was developing at the time, and where it's gone since that. But one of his goals as he came in was to make, in this case, to create that hybrid agency, this idea of a civilian police force merging with a military force to be able to combat organized crime. That was the goal, that was the mission, and as Yvonne mentioned, we really haven't seen them take on organized crime. If anything, the Guardia Civil is kind of still an unknown entity. They're everywhere. There's a lot of them out there. But the question is, what exactly are they doing? What exactly is their role and mission in Mexico today? But early on, that was the model that AMLO came up with. And the idea was to not make it subordinate to the military, but to have it under this civilian, in this case, the SSPC, or the Civilian Secretariat for Security and Civilian Protection, under Durazo. That was the first head at the time. So initially, it was stood up about 60,000. I mean, that's a considerable number. I think the entire Mexican military is like 250,000. So, I mean, you're talking about a big chunk of, creating a new military force in this case. The bulk of it did actually, about 80% did come from the military. And as I mentioned, many of them were those military police agencies, organizations out of SEDENA, and then, of course, the naval police out of SEMAR. And the other thing that he did do is he did disband the federal police. And again, the federal police, as you probably know, has a terrible reputation, a lot of corruption, a lot of violence. So in any case, it was kind of a popular move to disband them. The question was, what did you replace it with? So that was the goal early on. And so the initial paper that I wrote was looking at that. And so what I did is something called Swot Analysis. This is an analytical tool we use in the intelligence community. It basically stands for, as you see on the slide, strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats. So since this was early on in kind of the formative stage, I wanted to try to assess it in a sense was, well, could there be some positive things, not all negative, but could there be positive things that come out of that? And so one of them would be this idea, could in fact you demilitarize public safety by actually creating this sense? Get the military out of doing, in this case, countering transnational criminal organizations, which they wanted to do. And they were also, again, it would increase their ability to kind of go back to the barracks and do more of what they would consider to be more traditional military rules. And the other piece of it, it actually might lead to something to enhance community policing, which is a model we have in the United States. We've been debating that, we call intelligence-led policing versus community policing. Which model works best for confronting crime and some of the issues that we've had in our own country. Well, maybe this would be a way to do it with Mexico as well, by creating more police identity. And if these people came in the Guardia Nacional, came from those communities, there might be more identity with those communities and ability to have more, in this case, transparency and accountability. Of course, the weaknesses is that we tried it. In Mexico, as I mentioned, they tried reforming public safety, and that didn't work. The other part is that early on, even though it's meant to be a separate civilian cabinet level agency, really it was still under the military, because they were mostly military. They had to actually physically retire from the military to join that. The General Bucio, who formed it, had to basically resign his commission and then get hired back in as now a general in the National Guard. So that was part of the problem, is that again, it really didn't really come under that civilian agency that AMLO initially said it would. And again, we still had some of the similar problems with the lack of accountability and transparency. The other issue, I said, well, what would be some opportunities that come out of this, creating a new military organization? I jokingly say, we went through something called Space Force right now. A lot of people are still trying to figure out what that is and who they work for and what their future is. So, kind of similar, I said, could there something positive come out of this in terms of Mexico with the new National Guard? Well, could it, in this case, could it reflect more of Mexico's new nationalism? As a result of AMLO coming in, as a result of the Trump administration, a lot of the antagonism that was taking place, could in fact this organization help support that and actually contribute to a new identity in Mexico? And the other thing is, could it also model a U.S. model in terms of how we look at our National Guard in supporting governors and local communities? More disaster response, more ability to respond to the needs of the local communities. And as I mentioned, again, reflect more of those local populations and not that occupational force that the governors of Chihuahua was concerned about with Calderon's martial law. Of course, the threats always would, well, how did the military think about the National Guard? Did they see that as a threat? 60,000 troops, that's taken away from their resources. How would the military respond to that in terms of personnel, budget, missions? And would we also create, and this is the problems you had with the marginalization, misappropriation of resources whenever you create new organizations, how is they're being accountable and so on. And one of the other issues, and this ties into the U.S. side of it, is what would be the impact on MERIDA and some of the security assistance programs we had going on with Mexico. When I gave my talk here in 2019, I remember being asked a question about MERIDA and AMLO's perception of it. At the time, I don't think AMLO really understood what MERIDA was and the funding mechanisms and what it was actually providing for, because there were a number of different components. It wasn't all just going to the military. It was going to some of those issues that he wanted to be addressed, the community issues, the source problems, and things like that. So anyway, so that was also an issue. What would happen with the U.S.-Mexico security relationship? How would we relate to this new National Guard in terms of military-to-military type organizations and programs and stuff like that. So that was the initial research. That's what's reflected in the paper. So what I'm doing now is trying to follow up on that, is looking at what's changed, particularly looking at the roles and missions of the Guardia Nacional. AMLO made this statement in 2019 that they are reflecting Mexico, they are the community, that's who they are. So the question is that accurate? Is that in fact the case? And also, what are they doing? As we've seen so far, they were initially formed to combat transnational organized crime. We really don't see that happening. They got pushed into border security early on. If you remember, Trump then was going to say, was going to put basically a tax on, revenue going back and forth from Mexico, and this was seen as a threat if Mexico didn't do something about migration. And so suddenly we see the Guardia Nacional being pushed towards migration control on the northern border and also on the southern border. Some people jokingly said this was Trump's way of getting Mexico to pay for the wall, right? Okay, you just create a military organization to control migration in Mexico. We also see him pushed into public health because of COVID, infrastructure protection, and then some of the other ones, the civil defense, national disaster response, were kind of the more, I would consider more the kind of the positive things that I would hope that a National Guard would do. The other thing is what was going on with the armed forces at the same time. They got pushed into some new missions. Obviously, combating fuel theft became a big one. We see them constructing the Felipe Ángeles International Airport. They also got involved in border security and immigration control and some of these other issues. Probably of those things on that list, the only one that the Guardia Nacional has not also been somewhat involved in would be on peacekeeping or any type of foreign support. And this was a recent change for the Mexican military to actually contribute to international peacekeeping or provide military forces outside the country. Because of the Estrada Doctrine and some of Mexico's historical ideas about non-intervention and things like that, Mexican's military did not traditionally support peacekeeping roles and missions, but that has changed. So that is one role that we see as a change, and that also comes from some of the professionalization training and things as a result of that. So more recently, and this is the area that I'm been struggling with to try to get some answers on, is AMLO proposed a constitutional amendment basically now putting the GN under SEDENA. As far as I know, and from the interviews I've had up to this point, that has not been approved by Congress, but it's kind of like a de facto change. It's already happening anyway. They were always there to begin with, so now it's just becoming more formalized that now basically SEDENA controls the GN. As we mentioned, we don't, again, they seem to be deliberately avoiding confrontation with the transnational criminal organizations. They are throughout the country. We see them in quite a few places throughout the country. But I think it's primarily more in a show of force mission. It's kind of giving more perception that they're doing something, okay? And if I can use one example, it'd be after 9/11, when the United States shut down all air traffic and people didn't want to fly anymore. We put U.S. National Guard troops in U.S. airports. And some of you might remember that, going to fly and there'd be a National Guard troop with a rifle in their shoulder, with M16. What a lot of people don't realize is we never armed them. They never had bullets, so they could never actually stop anything, because we were afraid that these young soldiers would actually shoot somebody. The bottom line, it was done just for public safety perception. And I think similarly happened today with Mexico with the Guardia Nacional. They're everywhere. At least they're giving people a perception that the government's doing something. And if you look at some of the public opinion polls, like El Financiero and INEGI, a couple of them come out and said, their ratings are fairly high, 80-some% popular approval rates in terms of how people perceive the National Guard. If you interview academics and NGOs, you get a negative, much different perception on that. But in this case, I think the overall is that it's still kind of a work in progress. We're not really quite sure where it's going. And so this is what I'm researching right now. I'm trying to define what exactly will be the future. That one of them, of course, is post-AMLO. Will it continue after the end of the current administration? And the other one is, what is the U.S. role in this? Are we contributing to increased militarization of Mexico through some of the security assistance programs? I've had a chance to interview NORTHCOM people, trying to reach out to some of the other U.S. agencies and so on to kind of get their take on what's going on. But with this change going from MERIDA to now what's called the Bicentennial Framework, It provides a new venue for security assistance between United States and Mexico. And the question is, will there be direct funding programs going to GN versus SEDENA? Will SEDENA control that? How will all of that particularly take place? And ultimately, what will be the impact on civil-military relations in Mexico going forward? So let me end with this thought, and I'll throw this out there just as maybe a discussion point when we get into our Q&A. I use this reading with my students. It's kind of like what we call what-if analysis in the intelligence community. Well, what if there was a military coup? The gentleman you see in the picture there is Charles Dunlop. He was a student at the U.S. Army War College back in the 1990s. And it was right after the end of the Cold War, Gulf War. The United States military was now in this new vote, who's the bad guys, who's our threats. So he looked at, in this case, what was happening in the United States. He wrote it as a fictional account, but he based it with a lot of empirical data and good research. So he looked at the expanded role of the U.S. military in public safety and other non-military roles post-Cold War here in the United States. And as he said, as a result of that, people became more trusting of the military than they did of their own political leaders. And so as a result, at the end of the day, is that the military eventually loses confidence in the political parties, the politicians. They can do it better, and the military actually does come in, and there's a military coup in the United States in 2012. So he wrote the essay as a letter from a military officer in jail about to be executed, writing to a colleague explaining what happened. They were both students at the War College together. Let me tell you how I see this developing. So the question is, and of course one of the precipitating events in this scenario was the United States military lost its warfighting ethos, they went to war against Iran and were defeated. So could something happen in Mexico? If we push the Mexican military and GN and some of the other forces more into public safety roles or non-traditional military roles, building airports, is it going to lead to more corruption? Is it going to lead to more impunity of these forces, lack of transparency? And will the people just feel like, well, the military gets things done compared to our politicians, which are always fighting with each other anyway? So the question is then, could something similar happen in 2024? Because we know AMLO right now would like to stay in power. If he can change the Constitution. We've seen it happen with other political leaders in Latin America. So I just throw that out as kind of a thought piece kind of going forward. So just to kind of wrap things up so we can get to some questions. Early on, I think the SWOT analysis identified some of those positive and negatives of creating this new concept of a stability police force. Now I'm transitioning, I'm using a new methodology of something called pros, cons, faults, fixes, and that's really to assess some of these recent changes in terms of the roles and missions of GN. And in this case, being put fully under the military. What will that really mean going forward, and not having civilian accountability, civilian control over what was meant to be, again, initially a hybrid civil-military type of an institution. So I'm going to go ahead and end there and turn it back over to Yvonne so we can have some questions.
Thank you, Professor. I don't know if the audience here has any questions. I'm going to start with a question, and then I will ask you again if you have questions. I got some on Zoom. The first question, you said something about the problem of centralized activities. And President López Obrador basically has centralized many activities in the National Guard and SEDENA. For example, you said about the Felipe Ángeles International Airport. We know that the security will be in charge of the National Guard, and SEDENA is going to operate and manage that airport. That means that they are going to get revenue. So what are the risks of Mexico's armed forces having access to money and more power for the rule of law in Mexico? We know that it's a big issue in Mexico.
Definitely, I think that is a real concern going forward. Having worked with other Latin American militaries, I mean, there are other, and I'll just use an example like with the Chilean military. They have a big take of the copper industry, and that's how they fund a lot of the military budget in Chile. I would be concerned about that if, in fact, that's now seen as primarily a cash revenue. The military fund military, in this case, military development and things through infrastructure. I guess that's the main thing. So they're also involved with the Tren Maya, the new tourist train they're developing. So I think it is a troubling incident when you put the military directly involved in infrastructure, in public works, and things that actually have a financial incentive for them to draw from and actually be compensated through. Because you lose the funding model where they should be accountable to, in this case, to the members of Congress who basically approve a budget. And so you shouldn't have to say, well, the military is, getting paid out of that, we don't need to fund them. I said, I've seen that happen in other countries. It's not a good model. I'd be very concerned in Mexico if they go down this path.
Yeah, that's a big issue. I don't know if you have a question here. Okay.
Quick question. When the Mexican National Guard was created with the 60,000 personnel, all that personnel was taken away from the Army and the Naval? Was a net reduction or?
Yeah, that's one of the questions I haven't been able to really kind of determine, because part of the problem in Mexico is, and I saw this when I was a student down there, is we would go to Mexican military bases and you would see pictures on the wall of kind of like the units that were supposed to be part of that base. And you see like the leader and then maybe the NCOIC and then maybe a couple, and then it's like blank spaces go. So you never really knew how many people they actually had in a lot of those units, because for one way, it was a way to increase, drawing funds for those units just by saying we had 60, we have a brigade here of, 50,000 people, when in reality they may have 15,000. So part of it is that number, it was in fact that a 60,000 direct reduction taken from the military, or, were those numbers that weren't even there to begin with. So that's a little bit, my research right now is really haven't been able to define clearly what those numbers mean. But in essence, it is correct, though, that of that 60,000, the 80% of those did come from, in this case, people with military backgrounds. They were active duty, retired, or brought back on active duty, coming from the military, compared to primarily coming from the federal police. That was a much smaller number.
And as I follow up, the budget, was that budget transfer? Is that a new budget? Who pays for the?
Again, that's one of my
Okay.
research questions I haven't been able to really find out yet, is on the budget issues. The other issue I really have a question about is like pay and compensation. Does the Guardia Nacional get the same benefits? Was there an incentive for them to move into the GN compared to staying in the military? Is there a loss of, in this case, some of those, again, perks that the military typically had when they went to the GN? I've not been able to talk. I've only been able to talk to like a couple active duty military officers. They're mostly very difficult to open up about this. So those are some of the questions I'm still working on, trying to find answers to, because I think they're very critical in trying to understand what the relationship between these organizations will be going further down the road. If they stay subordinate to, in this case, SEDENA, will they just become another branch of the military, like the Air Force, also subordinate to the Army? Because the Air Force was always considered to be a secondary service in Mexico. It's always subordinate to the Army. It doesn't get the resources, it doesn't get the funding compared to the Army side of it. And so that would be my concern with the GN. If it's just subordinated to SEDENA, is it just going to be all the funds come into SEDENA and then SEDENA, distributes through there, as opposed to going through the civilian secretariat, which is initially where they were supposed to be, and then the funds being distributed through that civilian agency.
Any other question?
First, Professor Kilward, welcome to the great state of Texas.
Thank you.
And Professor Rodriguez Sánchez, muchas gracias por invitarme a su magnífico institución. For someone who loves Mexico, who had the privilege of working in Mexico, who had an office in Tijuana with a despacho de abogados for 4 years as a lawyer, who was in Tijuana when Colosio was, in Ensenada when Colosio was assassinated in 1994. I have this deep, deep admiration for the Mexican people. I was in Tijuana just before COVID on a delegation as a traductor for a delegation from China who needed someone to speak Chinese and Spanish. And I saw the booming of Tijuana. Professor Jesus Silva, who was the partner at my law firm, articulated Tijuana as the new New York of Mexico. So I see this strange tension with the greatness of Mexico and the problems that you and your colleagues are trying to address. And it hurts my heart, my love of Mexico. I want to say this. And so I guess getting to my questions from a 20,000-foot perspective. I have no way to talk the details with someone of your caliber, sir. But would there be a possibility to see like the influence of the decriminalization of drugs here in the United States? Would that possibly be a solution to some of the terrible violence that's breaking my heart in Mexico? Is there any talk of that? I know that there seems to be a trend of decriminalizing or wanting to decriminalize marijuana in Mexico. Would that be part of the solution, sir? And am I too far afield with that question to pose that to you?
No, actually, I'll be honest with you. That's probably not my area. It's more of Yvonne's, looking at criminal activity and things like that. I just know from looking at the threat as a military officer and doing a threat assessment. When the military looks at different organizations, you assess combat capabilities, things like that. I think, and I'm going to turn it over to Yvonne on that. But it seems like so many of these cartels have expanded into so many different areas now. It's not just drugs anymore. It's avocados. I mean, it's iron ore being shipped out of Lázaro Cárdenas. So I think, if anything, they're more entrepreneurial, that if in fact they did decriminalize it, they would just find other venues to continue their activities. But I think the issue is, for somebody from a military perspective, and I'm looking at how do you combat transnational organized crime. That's a big part of U.S. Northern Command's focus on security assistance to Mexico. And that's where a lot of the MERITA funding was going in, to increase the military capabilities to go after these heavily armed gangs. And many of them, like the Zetas, were former military themselves, so they had a lot of combat power, and they were outmanned, outgunned in many cases. The bigger side for me on that would be, what are we contributing, and what can the U.S. do to help prevent the criminalization or the arming of a lot of these criminal gangs? And that's the transiting of arms across the border. In Mexico, the Mexicans, government will say the same thing. You want us to control drugs, we want you to control arms. And I had a surreal conversation at U.S., it was in the Joint Task Force North. We had just crossed the border from Ciudad Juarez. This was in 2009. I was with my Mexican colleague, Abelardo Rodriguez, and Canadians. We went to Joint Task Force North. We're sitting with U.S. military officers, and we're talking about Mexico's, the crime problem and all that, and said, well, we want Mexico's help in controlling drugs across the border. Abelardo asked, well, why don't we get U.S. help controlling arms coming across the border? And this one U.S. military officer says, well, we have the Second Amendment in this country. People are allowed to own arms. I'm like, that's your response? I mean, that's not a response. I mean, that doesn't mean you can transit them illegally across the border. So I think we have a problem in this country about what we can do to help that process in terms of reducing the capacity of a lot of these criminal organizations when it comes to, at least on the military side, from their war-fighting capacity. I'll let you address kind of the drug side of it and whether you think that would help the decriminalization.
Well, I think that, as you said, the issue is that both countries have to realize about that problem. And in some way, Mexico, President Andrés Manuel López Obrador is not facing any problem of security. So if that's the case, we are going to still have a lot of problem of drug trafficking on the border. So the National Guard was supposed to be helping that area, but it's not good doing that. And that's why I have, in that regard, a question about the last elections, that we saw that organized crimes were involved in Mexico in the elections. And we can see, well, I'm going to ask Professor Kiro about that maybe we can end up with a narco state, or I don't know if we can possibly see in the future, because we saw that problem at the border, but now we have in the whole country that problem. So I don't know if we can end up with a narco state if the inaction of the federal government continues and the National Guard is not doing that job So what do you think, Professor?
I know right before I left the military, there was a study that was put out by the U.S. Joint Forces Command, which has since been disbanded, but they were looking at future threats, and one of them was to look at failed states. And they wrote a very controversial report because they said, two states that are very potentially could become failed states were Mexico and Pakistan at the time. Of course, Pakistan has nukes, which makes it much more complicated. But when that report came out, it was like suddenly said, well, Mexico, how could it possibly be Mexico? I think the response has been, and what I tell people is, I don't think Mexico's in danger of becoming a failed state. I think they have failed states, meaning that there's parts of Mexico where there is such control by these transnational criminal organizations where they do actually co-opt the police forces, the military, the political leaders. I mean, we've seen that, of course, obviously, in many parts of the country itself. Could that expand then, become a kind of a national concern? I do have concern, and I share your love for Mexico too. It's a country, me encanta mucho, and I've enjoyed traveling and living in Mexico. And it is heartbreaking to see what's happening to a lot of these communities where there is a sense of insecurity, where people just don't really, again, who do you turn to? And when Calderon turned to the military and sent them in to fight, the war against these transnational criminals, he was calling in the cavalry. I mean, there was nobody back there. Those were the reserves. And we call strategic reserves in military forces, like, you don't commit all your forces. But when he did that, it was all in. And the question is now, what's next? This Guardia Nacional is supposed to have taken on that role, let the military out. It's not doing it. But if people are feeling, again, if the public opinion polls can be trusted and people have at least a perception of some greater security, then maybe there is some value to putting more of them in their gray and white uniform, whatever this new uniform they wear, which is meant to be different from the military uniform. And at least people feel more secure, then there is some advantage to, at least from a public perception standpoint. But it's still not dealing with the specific problems of Mexico, which is, again, this idea of these criminal organizations that have, in fact, increased their, obviously, their capabilities and breadth over the country. So.
Yeah. Okay, so I have a quick question from the audience on Zoom. We have only like 5 minutes. Oh my God, where it is now? Okay. Do you see Andrés Manuel López Obrador having a strong hold over the military, or is the military just following his initiatives pragmatically, duty-wise?
That's a good question. It's funny because when I've been doing interviews with academics, with government officials, NGOs, some different organizations, and I asked them that question and said, who's really behind this? Is it really AMLO in charge, or is the military in charge? Who's the ones really kind of driving this train right now? And they kind of said, because I was interested in Bucio. I actually spoke with somebody who was involved in his academic research. Bucio actually has a PhD. He's very educated. The General Bucio heads the National Guard, very non-traditional military. So I was thinking, like, where does he kind of see his role in that? And his comment back, this one particular individual said, well, he's just a military officer following orders. He doesn't really have an agenda. He's got no real future. He doesn't have an issue with the guard and all that. AMLO told him to do that, he'll do that. So at least the perception is that the military is following the lead of AMLO as president of the country, that they're being loyal soldiers, they're saluting, they're doing their mission. I would have a different take a little bit on that. I think to a certain extent that is the public persona, the public perception. But the military, as I mentioned to you, it's not apolitical. The Mexican military has always been behind the scenes. They're very influential, and we've seen presidents defer to the military throughout Mexico's history. And if you can think about that, the 1968 Tlatelolco massacre with Diaz Ordaz, and yeah, there was issues there about the military taking control and giving the country back to the president. I got quotes that say that. So I think the military always has been a key player and much more involved than probably they want to admit. But I would, at least for the public perception side of it, at least there is a perception that they are basically just being loyal to AMLO. The question that becomes, what happens after AMLO?
Yeah.
And that was the question I had initially. It's like, what happens after the loses political power?
The same.
If I have time to ask, so there have been in the last 10, 12 years 3 political parties, PAN, PRI, and then now the MORENA. Is the allegiance of the military to the president or to the party in power?
at the, when you go to the Escuela Superior de Guerra, they have their flag ceremony right there in front, and they have a saying, there's carved in the stone, they said, La patria es primero, the country is first. We're loyal to the country first. But we all know that they were very loyal to the political structure and the party, and as I mentioned, the whole Aguinaldo thing and all that, was always to kind of create the institutional loyalty to the political process themselves. I had a discussion with, if you guys remember, when Cardenas broke off and formed the PRD, remember he was considered to be, Lázaro Cardenas' son and, key pillar of the PRI and all that, and suddenly he broke off. I had military officers in Mexico say, we could never support him as president. He's a communist. We could never do that. He's disloyal. He left the PRI. How could we ever support? So I'm like, okay, but if he's elected president, aren't you subordinate to whoever is elected president? And they're like, no, we would never allow that to happen. Oh, okay. So the question now becomes, you're right, are they primarily loyal now to AMLO? I think AMLO basically has co-opted the military to an extent that it's supporting his goals and agenda, which is basically to try to consolidate power and increase MORENA's, standing, and hopefully, have a MORENA, at least a MORENA, candidate win the next election to continue many of his policies and programs. But I think the earlier identity in terms of the Mexican military, I think, has expanded beyond just personalism of an individual to now do think of this idea of a national identity of the nation and so on. And that's why I thought the Guardia Nacional, at least in my original analysis, said, is there some possibility they could take on a new identity and support Mexican nationalism, similar to kind of have our National Guard does that at kind of a state level and local level, in supporting those local communities and supporting the people that are in those communities. I haven't seen that. I'm concerned now that the Guard being brought up under SEDENA is just going to continue to, again, force more of the traditional models, as opposed to kind of create a new SPF with a new national identity, which would then get away from the personalism and identity with a particular individual or a political party. So honestly, at this point, I think the jury's still out. I think we have to see what's going to happen in 2024. That's why, if you notice, I put question marks on AMLO's, will his term end in 2024, or will he actually be able to change the Constitution and stay on? So.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Professor Quiro, for your very interesting remarks on the National Guard. I appreciate your time. Thank you, everyone, and we'll see you at the next event at the Baker Institute, and have a wonderful day. Thank you.